Welcome to the DataStack Show. Kostas, today we are talking with James from Great Expectations. Now, we've already talked with Ben from that company, and so we sort of have gotten some interesting thoughts on definitions around data quality, et cetera. But Great Expectations is a fascinating tool. It's a command line tool, or they have a command line interface. It's a Python library. And so the way that they approach the problem from a technical standpoint is super interesting. One of my questions is going to be around, if we have time to get to it, around how they think about the interaction between different parties within an organization who need to agree on sort of data definitions, right? That's like a huge thing with data quality, right? You have some sort of variance from like some sort of data definition. So I want to hear their approach on that, both like does their product support it, but also from like a philosophical standpoint, because, there's sort of, potentially some limits to what software can solve, in that regard. So that's my burning question. How about you?
Well, it seems that you are going after the hard questions, so I have to be the good cop this time.
You're usually the bad cop.
So, my intention is like to talk with him like a little bit more about like the product and like the technology itself. We had like the opportunity with Ben like to talk a lot about data quality and like the need and like all that stuff. Let's say like a little bit of like a higher level. So I think it's like a great opportunity to get a little bit more tangible around like the products, how it is used, what kind of problems it solves, and in what unique ways these problems get solved by Great Expectations. So that's what I'm going to ask. And
all right, well, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Outro, just roll right into it. Oh, you're using the Herd podcast mug. It's a really high quality piece, actually.
Yeah, and they only sent me one. Like, they should keep sending more of that stuff.
Well, I think in our second year, they'll send another gift. But they didn't skimp on the quality. That's the thing.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't they send that as like a gift for like your first year working together?
When was that? Like, I think I got that. That was like on Christmas or something.
Tires back on the road. We're like little kids here. Okay. Kostas, I tried to think of like a really good like takeaway from this substantive material from the show, but I'm going to phone it in because I can't get over how much I enjoy the like multiple references to Charles Dickens, not only in the name of the product, but like pip install, like Pip's a character in Great Expectations. And then like the verbose nature of what you name an expectation, like those being really long. Just a data quality product as a Python library having such like clever references to Charles Dickens it just makes me really, really happy. So that's my big takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like some marketing genius behind Great Expectations. I don't know, like maybe that's what we should do with them, actually, like get the founders and get into like the conversation of how they came up with that stuff. Like that's,
yeah.
I mean, it's not like a data related conversation, but I don't know. I think it feels like a very fascinating topic, like how they came up like with that, because it is pretty unique and it's like extremely smart. Like you can have like a conversation with someone from Great Expectations and like every other sentence like make a connection with Dickens, which is it's kind of crazy. So yeah, we need to figure out, like we need to get the playbook from them somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great to have all the founders on the show and have them read passages from the book Great Expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. We should do that. But outside of this, like, okay, it's always like a great pleasure, like to discuss with the folks from Great Expectation, because you can see like there are like some very interesting ideas and how like very deep knowledge around like how they solve the problem of like quality and how they're like moving forwards. And I'm also like looking forward to see like their cloud products and what these will bring into this like whole experience of like doing data quality with great expectations.
I agree. All right. Well, thank you for joining us on the DataStack Show. Tell someone about the show if you haven't yet. We always like to get new listeners, and we will catch you on the next one. James, welcome to the DataStack Show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Well, give us your brief background and tell us what you do at Great Expectations.
I'm the CTO at Great Expectations and one of the co-founders of the project together with Abe Gong. It's crazy to think this. It's been about 5 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
And it's been quite a journey, driven tremendously by community and now the, company getting to focus on product is really delightful. Before working on Great Expectations, I spent most of my career in the US federal government, specifically in the intelligence community. And I was an analyst. So I did a lot of work on originally cybersecurity and understanding strategic cyber threats and then broader political modeling. And in both of those domains, I had a really exciting chance to be able to move back and forth between very quantitative and very qualitative types of analysis. I sometimes joked, it was like some of my job was Microsoft Word, and then I'd go have a job in Microsoft Excel and back to Word and then back to Excel. Obviously, not just Excel for data volumes, but that's been a lot of how I've gotten to spend my time. And then now it's just a delight to work across, again, so much of the domain of superconductive.
Yeah, very cool. Tons of questions about Great Expectations, but really quickly, was it, it's always interesting to hear about things like political modeling, et cetera, right? Because, I think we all subconsciously, those of us who haven't done it, which is most people, you have this idea of kind of what it's like in the movies, of like uncovering all these secrets and all that sort of stuff. But tell us what it's really like, to sort of be an analyst and do political modeling.
The problem with that question, Eric, is, if I tell you I have to kill you and you're so far away. So, no,
I love it.
Look, firstly, I think one of the key things that's really important to remember in that field is like there's a whole bunch of different sources for how you build models. And I think a lot of the contemporary machine learning and AI focus is around the structure of data and like trying to use data to be the driving factor of building an understanding. And at least in my experience, a lot of the kind of practical modeling applications are still very much driven by significant domain expertise being put into the model itself. The structure of the model plays a significant role. And so it's like maybe one way to say it is, big data was all the rage, and there's still significant worlds where it doesn't take a lot of data. And in some ways, like the defining characteristic of the intelligence world is that maybe there's just one critical piece of information that changes everything, and you're in the hunt for that.
Super interesting. Well, I could go on and on about that, but I want to talk about some of the guts of Great Expectations. So we talked with Ben and had some really good chats around sort of definitions around data quality, et cetera. And so I'm excited to dig into, sort of the technical details. So first question about Great Expectations. So, and actually before we get going, could you just give us a super high level, like what does Great Expectations do for our listeners who may not be familiar?
Absolutely. Great Expectations gives users the ability to make verifiable assertions about data. So it allows you to define what you expect. It also helps you learn what to expect from previous data. And then we can test those expectations against new data as it arrives and produce clear documentation describing whether or not it meets the expectations, and when it doesn't, what exactly is different.
Super cool. Okay, so this is my first question, and I have actually, in looking at the show on the calendar, I've been so excited to ask you this question. So data quality is a broad problem, and there are a number of ways to solve it, right? I mean, even including just sort of brute force SQL with, really raw, messy data on the warehouse, right? Which everyone, everyone hates. But what's interesting to me, sort of, if I can put it this way, about like the geography of the data stack as it relates to data quality, is you can address the issue of data quality in multiple places, right? And maybe you do want to address it in multiple places. But so the two-part question. The first part is where does Great Expectations sit in the stack and sort of in the geography, of the data flow?
Great question. And I think the answer is sort of everywhere, but it's not the same expectations that will exist everywhere. So when you think about that stack that you described, sort of the stack of data, I think there are two pretty distinct things that happen during that. One is data kind of moves between systems and is potentially enriched or augmented or clarified along that process. And the other is that data is synthesized, right? Like you have roll up, you have an analytic running, you have a new model running on data, and the output of all those things, it's another data set. So there's two pretty distinct operations in a data system in that way. And for each of those types of operations, Great Expectations helps you both protect the inputs and protect the outputs. And actually, one of the things that we've talked about on our team that it makes Great Expectations powerful, but also, it's a challenge for us to ensure we're making it easy for users to understand how to use it effectively, is helping to kind of differentiate those different ways that people are addressing data quality problems.
Super interesting. Okay, so can you dig in one click deeper? So those two sort of key points where data is moving between a system and then data is being synthesized to result in another data set. How does Great Expectations interact with those 2 points, right? Because one is sort of, well, and actually this is more of a question for you, right? Like if data is moving from systems, it can either sort of be raw data that's, sort of maybe being like flattened out to go into a warehouse, right? Or there actually could be transformations happening, et cetera. So I would love to hear about that. And then, also the flip side where, data is being synthesized.
Yeah. So I think for the first case where data is moving through transformation or enrichment, I think of that as being really applicable to what I'd call a contract model. So, there's vendors that provide data, and the fact that we can go out and buy data sets that are curated and by definition high quality, for example, it could be stock data, it could be health insurance records, it could be any number of different, it could be weather data. There's all kinds of data sets that have been processed and have characteristics that make them valuable for certain kinds of decisions. So the first thing in there is being able to ensure that both parties understand what they're getting, right? Like when you're buying something, we want a contract about that. We want to know, hey, I have a column and this is what it should look like. Now, in the past, a lot of the ways that we dealt with that was we had these like endless giant coordination meetings, or, and I kid you not, I've been the recipient of, I think like 175 page diagram describing this data set that we were buying. And it was like, what do I do with this, right? So big part of what we're doing there is we're making it possible for you to just agree in very precise terms that are self-healing. The documentation, that 175-page PDF, is self-healing, because the biggest problem with those things is that they immediately get out of date. But by making that contract a living artifact, something that can be tested as data continues to flow, it can be immediately flagged when there's a problem, and then we can also update the contract. So with respect to the second thing, the analogy that I think of there is kind of like from physics, the concept of an emergent property. So, if you look at a volume of air, you can think about like, okay, where are all the molecules? Like what are their characteristics? And like, those might be the columns, this one is at location X, Y, Z and has momentum alpha and so forth. But in an analytic context, what we're doing is we're looking at a higher order property, pressure, volume, right? We don't need to look at all those individual records anymore. And that's what a model is doing, right? It's like taking all these individual pieces of information, synthesizing them together. And the key thing that happens there is that the nature of the information is completely different. And we're reasoning about a different quantity. So I'm not reasoning anymore about X's and Y's and Z's. I'm reasoning about pressures and volumes. And being able to support that kind of transition is really, really important. And is one of our critical goals, and why we have done a lot of investment in supporting a contributor gallery, for example, where people can define expectations that are meaningful for them. Like this, expect this column to be in a particular geography, right? So, we're not saying it's like has to be an X value and a Y value. We're saying like it needs to be in New York. Like if this is a lat long, it needs to be in New York. And that reflects how we think about data. And it helps you move to that emergent property, which is, I think, where data quality really needs to be as a field, is because that's where we're helping stakeholders really get to the value they need.
Yeah. Okay. So super helpful. And I love the physics analogy, sort of the individual components that make up something like pressure is a super helpful analogy. The second part of the question is why you chose to solve it that way. And I would love to hear you talk about maybe ways that you had seen it solved before, and then why you decided to sort of structure Great Expectations, the way that you did.
That's such a rich question. I love it. The first thing is like ways I've seen it solved before. And I think actually one of the important things, it's not just before. When we encounter users of Great Expectations, I actually consider a point of pride being the fact that many of them are like, oh, I've written something like this. Like I've solved this. Like I've written the test for nullity, for volume, for means, for stationarity of a distribution. And the reason I think that's really a good thing is that it reflects the fact that we're kind of in tune with how people process the world. Now, what's the key difference? Like the key insight, I think, that makes it different and like how we're solving the problem is that we're providing a what I would call like a general purpose language. We like to call it like an open shared standard, where it's designed. I mean, like some of the hallmarks of Great Expectations are the names of expectations are incredibly verbose, and people love it. I mean, I love it. It's very precise. Expect column KL divergence to be less than. It's like this long name,
sure,
but it means something, and it helps people really express their expectation. The key thing that so why that you asked this question like, well, why that? What does it give you? I think one of the most important things that it gives you is explainability. So when I see that some piece of data maybe doesn't match my expectation, then it can explain what the expectation was because I told it what the expectation was. And we can go into like, if we get in, we should dive into kind of some of the more technical details because what I don't want to suggest is you have to sit at your keyboard and type, expect this 100,000 times. Like, no, you don't need to do that. But what we can do is really make it easy for you to get that very explainable report back of, all right, you didn't think there was, this column is supposed to exist. It doesn't, right? Which many cases, those are like the real problems that break dashboards or so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes total sense. And the verbose naming couldn't be better aligned with sort of the Dickens reference. I'm
impressed. Yeah, you're totally right.
That's great. Super long, one-page sentences. Hopefully your expectation, in Great Expectations isn't a page long. Okay, Kostas, I've been stealing the mic. Go for it.
Yeah, you did, but it's fun, so you can continue doing it if you want. It's fine with me. But I have a few questions to ask, and like I'd like to focus a little bit more like on the product experience first, and also like the problem that would lead someone to a solution like great expectations, right? Like, like many times we assume that everyone who listens out there, like they are aware of like why we are doing the things that we are doing, but that's not always the case, right? Like, so I would like to start like from the very, very basics. Like, let's think of like, and I'd love to hear that like from you, of like describe the work of like a data engineer or like whoever is like, let's say, the person who faces problems that can't be solved with great expectations, and like describe, like go through like a small scenario until we reach the point where we can say, yeah, now we can talk about great expectations and how this problem can be solved with this. So can you do that for us, please?
I can do my best to present some. I think there's a lot of different ways, but I think one of the key things, one of the whys, like why do people turn to this tool, is that they want to get ahead and be proactive instead of reactive. Already, a lot of data engineering teams face this question of, I got the phone, and we call them data horror stories sometimes, and I think other people have used similar terms, and these are out there all the time. But you get a call, hey, my dashboard is broken, and it's when somebody says my dashboard is broken, I think it's useful to think about the way they're seeing the world. And so, a great example would be salesperson, Northeast region sales show 0. Mm-hmm. I know that's not true. And the reason I like framing it in that way is like they had an expectation. Like I was out there, I made the sale. I saw, I wrote the ink down. I know it's not 0. I expected it to not be 0, but it's 0. So the data engineering team turns to a tool like Great Expectations in that case, because they want to be ahead. So they don't want to get the call, hey, the dashboard is broken. They want to see the issue first and be able to resolve it before it ever becomes this broken or embarrassment. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the really common problems. Another really common problem is like the pager duty problem. Like if sometimes in the example I gave, that first example, it's a semantic failure, right? Like the dashboard ran. There is a number in the cell. It's just not the number the person expected. Other times it's like you have a schema mismatch. Or a load that totally failed, or something like that, where the key thing that you're trying to solve is like, I don't want to get a page at page at midnight. And if I am responding to a problem, I want to have the diagnostic information that I need to be able to get to a solution right away, and to be able to zero in on where the problem actually happened. Yeah, I think, and I think, there's variations on those, but I think kind of this they're both kind of forms of being able to be proactive in addressing like your core function that you're trying to solve as a data organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I have like a slightly trickier question now. I think tricky also for me to communicate like in the best possible way. So when we are talking about quality, in general, like data and quality in data, like I'm always, let's say, confused, or I'm going like back and forth between like two definitions. Okay, one definition, and I'll start like using like a little bit of like metaphors here, is more like the stamp of QA that we have on products, right? Which is more about like the consumer of the product, in this case, data, to trust the product that is getting used, right? So that's like one reason that one way that we implement like quality, like as like humans in general, like in products. The other is like use these tools like Great Expectations as a debugging tool, right? Like as a way for the developer or like the engineer or whoever like is responsible like for anything related to the consumption of the data to figure out like what is wrong, right? Now, obviously, both functions are important, but in your opinion, like both like in terms of both like for Great Expectations, but like for quality, like data quality in general, like which one of these two let's say, definitions of like quality you think are like closer to what is needed today?
That is a tricky question. I think I almost need to add a third one in order.
Oh, let's do that. Yeah.
In order to be able to like flesh them out.
Yeah. Let's do that.
And it's very similar to debugging, but but like just sticking on the theme for a moment of proactivity, it's like the proactive debugging, i.e. it's the way that you generate your expectations in the first place. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that's really critical is, like you alluded to this in the first definition, you know, quality is a term that is relative to a purpose. You know, in some ways, quality is like your fitness for doing some particular job. And so it will vary. Like the same data is high quality for purpose one and not high quality for purpose two, for example.
Yep.
And so being able to like support the process of generating your understanding, like kind of your mental model of the world, I think is actually one of the most important areas that the broader data quality ecosystem can support, can do. So, okay, so I added the third, and then maybe what that lets me do is say, look, they're all important. It's really more of a phase. And to be honest with you, this is something we've been talking about a lot on our team internally lately, is making sure that we're not trying to have the same conceptual objects, like the same, you know, in this case, it's like literal code objects, like the same objects in Great Expectations sort of do too much, but rather exposing APIs and interfaces that are more intuitive for the way that you're using the tool. Mm-hmm. And that might be in this phase of I'm building and creating my expectations. It might be in the phase of I am, kind of ensuring quality, i.e. performing that QA function to make sure that I'm going to meet the needs of the product or the downstream data consumer. And then it also might be I'm performing a debugging task. Now that last one is pretty challenging for us today, because it's very interactive, and it's also interactive on a potentially historical data set. And so there's a lot of nuance there that we should dive into if we're going to get into more of the technical detail. I don't know if that, I basically sidestepped your question and I said all three, but.
No, it's fine. I think like it's very, first of all, like there's value in like adding the third dimension there. Like, to be honest, like I don't expect, I think these questions are like work in progress, like, and both the questions and the answers. And I think it's important like to ask these questions, even if we don't have like definitely like answers right now, but we need to think about that stuff. And I think it's important also like for the people, not like us who at the end we sell products, but around that stuff, but like the people who their job is like to ensure like the quality of the data or deliver, let's say, data sets to people, like to work on them and like all these things, to have, let's say, to ask the right questions, or have the right, let's say, conceptual models around like that kind of stuff. So I think there's always like value in these conversations, even if like, let's say, the answers are not yes or no, right? Like it's fine, it's good. It's important like to have the conversation. So
to that end, actually, I think there's one part of the quality as QA that is really important, but that is I think a little bit less obvious or less clear in a lot of platforms that kind of purport to provide data quality, and that's that it's really a two-way street. The person who is, and I mean both, like there's the provider and the consumer data, but also if I'm providing a analytic model or a curated data set or a dashboard or just a data product, right? A giant collection of records. Like it's actually potentially very useful for me to be able to kind of package together with that a description of what I think this is good at doing. Yep. And similarly, if what I'm providing is a model without data, it's actually very valuable for me to be able to say, when you use this model, make sure that your data looks like this. And that way you can clarify, like it's like making like IKEA is really good because the instructions are simple in some ways, or Lego. Think about Lego, these incredible instructions. Like imagine being able to give a consumer of a complicated product like Lego, like really elegant instructions based around how the data looks.
That's a very interesting point. How do you think we can get there? Because I don't feel like we have that today, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, I think the answer is going to be that we allow people to provide expectation suites together with their products that are validated at the time that the person brings in their own data.
Sure, but okay, let's get a little bit deeper into that, because like also touches like the product experience. So an expectation might be like interpreted in a very different way from a technical point of view than from, let's say, the point of view of like the consumer of the data, who might not be like a technical person, right? Like, let's say we have like a marketeer, like at the end, like the marketeer wants to know, can I trust that like the segmentation that I'm going to do on this data is actually like representative of the reality that I'm addressing out there? But on the other hand, like the person who's like the data engineer, like probably doesn't even know what segmentation is, or they shouldn't care, right? Like it's not like their job to do that, or their brains are not like trained to think that way. Maybe they think more in terms of like the skewness of data, or like, do we have nulls or not nulls, or I don't know, like what are the, like this kind of parameters. So how do we bridge these two? Like how do we semantically, maybe it's like the right way to say that, like translate the expectations from one domain to the other, right? So we can apply them at the end.
I mean, that's such a beautiful question for me. Like to me, that is the core of what we're doing. And so, like, let's dive in a little bit of like how Great Expectations does that. It's basically that the way we decompose things is we have a core object, like one of the key concepts in Great Expectations is called the expectation. And what that does is it is a semantic translation machine. We'll often call it a grammar, right? It's this long verbose sentence. Now, I definitely don't want to suggest that this is like an easy solved problem, like go pick up the one, but let's take your hard example of a marketer who says, what they're saying is expect this segmentation to make sense, right? Yeah. Like that's kind of how they're thinking about the world. So we have to decompose that into what we call metrics. And so what an expectation does is it asks for metrics about the data, and metrics are a very general concept in Great Expectations. So it doesn't have to just be like a statistic. Mean could be a metric. Number of nulls could be a metric, but so could number of nulls outside of a particular range, or country code of lat-long pairs. Right? These are also metrics. So it's a pretty general compute engine under the hood. So the expectation author is providing this declarative, verbose declarative language. And then they're also doing that translation into what are the metrics that make this mean that. And then Great Expectations is sort of an orchestration engine that goes out, reaches and touches the data, gets the values, finds the values of those metrics, does the comparison reassembly, and then surfaces the result in the language of the way the marketer was thinking about the world.
Okay. This is great. How do we assign metrics? Like, how do we come up with the right metrics for the great expectation from the great marketeer?
Yeah, well, I think our answer to that is community.
Okay.
And so we have what we call our expectations gallery, where we're trying to encourage, and we want to encourage a robust process of community engagement for people to be able to expand the vocabulary of expectations to include things that make sense in their domain, that do these metric translations. And so in order to do that, they're adding new expectations, they're adding new metrics. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we're providing the substrate for expressing that, or like the mechanism for allowing people to express it. But then letting them take ownership of the semantic and domain model, and and like the short version, of course, is like there isn't a right answer to the question, is this the right, is this the valid segmentation? It depends on the organization. And so one of the things we see a lot is what we call custom expectations. So, yes, schema, nullity, volume, all these things, people use those expectations a lot, but also they say, okay, well, I want to say expect columns, and I'll pick an example we've used a lot, expect column values to be a valid ICD code. And under the hood, that might just be translated into a fancy regex. But the fact that there's that translation is actually really important, because that's what makes it usable to the marketer consumer in our case.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's super interesting. And like, how is the engagement of the community around that? Like, what have you seen so far? I mean, okay, I obviously I'm aware of the great community that Great Expectation has, but what have you seen like happening there, and what you have seen like working and what not?
Sure. And it's like the power of open source is like one of these things that just blows my mind over and over. So I certainly can't suggest that I can wrap my head around all of it. Some of the things that work, we've done hackathons, and we've, like I mentioned, produced this gallery. We're doing some experiments in the space of what we call packages, where we have domain leaders in a domain or field who are willing to kind of commit and say, these are expectations that are like useful and valid or valuable to be able to understand the kinds of concepts that are relevant. And like an example actually of a community contributed project that's really been interesting is a data profiling framework, where there's expectations that are built around the Capital One data profiler, and they use that kind of as the semantic engine to infer types and allow you to make expectations like there shouldn't be PII here. And then that gets translated through. Now we didn't build that on our team, but we are excited about supporting that as a community. Now your question was also where are the challenges, and like, to be honest, yeah, there's still challenges, right? Like there's lots and lots of expectations out there. There's a discovery problem, there's synthesis, there's a lot of work left to do in that space, or not left. There's a lot of opportunities still to be had for helping people engage. And like, that's where what I would really emphasize is our goal of making this a shared standard that people can engage on together and improve. So that's an exciting area. That's one area. There's lots of other exciting things we're working on too, but that's definitely
well, these are like very, very super interesting, like parts of like growing and building and like having actually like the community as part of the product experience itself, right? It is part of the product at the end. Anyway, that's another conversation for another time. Like, we can discuss a lot about the community. So what I want to ask you now is like, okay, we talked about the problems, like how you think about like the solution. But let's talk a little bit more about like the experience that the user has with Great Expectations. So how do I use Great Expectations? I mean, I have like let's say an idea right now that there are some expectations somewhere that I'm like testing against my data, but like, how do I operationalize Great Expectations as part of my like day-to-day job, like as a data engineer?
Yeah, that's a great question. We think of it as there's sort of 4 key steps to what it means to use Great Expectations, and we call it like our universal map. First, just to be like really explicit on it, Great Expectations is a Python library. So you run a pip install in the case of Great Expectations today. Now, not to get into like the commercial aspect, we are building a cloud product as well that's designed to make it like very accessible, especially kind of just expanding the domain, the reach of people, but also kind of simplifying the setup, but just kind of setting it up. So, we run our pip install. Next step is connecting to data. Now, this is where it could mean I'm just going to grab a batch of data, like I'm going to read a CSV off my file system and like work with this data. There are also, there's more you can do to connect to data where you also configure the ability for Great Expectations to understand what your assets are and how they're divided into batches, so that as new batches of data come in, we can understand the stream of data as a unit. So you connect to data, and to be honest with you, that's an area where I see us needing to do some work. Like some of the magic of Great Expectations early on came from the fact that connect to data was a one-liner, read CSV. And as we've added the power and expressivity around ensuring that you can understand batches and so forth, it has become a little more difficult there. And so that's one of the things we're actually working on right now, is like bringing that kind of magical viral experience back. Anyway, so next thing I do is I connect my data. It's like literally I add a data source. It could be pointing it at an S3 bucket, say, or connecting to a database, to a warehouse. And that's one of the important things about Great Expectations is we work across all the different backends, right? All the SQL dialects, Spark, Pandas in memory, pulling data in from S3, all that, any of those things. So we do that configuration. The next thing is you create your expectations. And for us, that's a notebook experience. So you're in a Jupyter notebook, you have this sample of data, and it's an interactive real-time experience. I say, expect column values to be not null. And I get an immediate response back. We check that right away and it says, hey, success, or actually, 5% of these values are null. And so what we see there is this interactive exploratory process where you're creating expectations. Another way you can do that is with profiling, where you ask Great Expectations, go out and build a model of this data set and propose a long list of expectations back to me, and I'll choose which ones to accept, maybe all of them. And then that will become my expectation suite. So create expectations. And then the last step is the validation. So what you do, typically what we see people run is what we call a checkpoint, and they'll embed that into a Airflow pipeline or into a prefect pipeline or wherever they're running their validations. And it's just an operation, Great Expectations run checkpoint. And what that then does is produce a validation result, which we convert into a web page that you can share and post with your team that says, here were the expectations. These ones passed, these ones didn't pass. If they didn't pass, here's some examples of what went wrong. And so you have that very tangible, shareable, visible report of what the state of your validation was. So that's how Great Expectations gets used in practice.
Okay, that's super cool. And okay, you mentioned that you support pretty much, let's say, every backend out there. How does this translate in terms of interacting with this backend? So let's say, for example, I have my data on a data lake on S3, right? Or the same data, I might have it on a Snowflake. So first of all, is the experience the same that I get for Great Expectations, regardless of what I have as a backend?
Yeah, that's one of the pieces of magic is, we talked about that trend, what Great Expectations is doing is translating between expectations and metrics. Mm-hmm. And then one layer deeper than that, we translate from the metric into what we call an execution engine. So okay. if we're in a SQL, let's suppose we're connected to a SQL warehouse, we'll translate the request for the metric mean into the SQL dialect that will give us back that metric. Or if we're in Spark, we'll translate that into the appropriate Spark command to say, give me the mean value back. So Great Expectations is handling that and then sort of rebubbling it back up into the semantic layer for you.
Okay, and this is something that's always interactive, or it's something that let's say I run the expectation every 1 hour, is the result kept somewhere so I can go and see how the expectation has changed in time, or how does this part work, because I can see they're like generating even more data at the end, right? Like,
yeah, totally right. Wow, this is such a rich area for us to continue to build on, to be honest with you. So today, the way that works is like the core validation result is a big kind of JSON artifact. Like I mentioned, we do render that and translate it into HTML. So you have if you go to your generated data docs site, you'll see just see a list of all the validations that I've run. Now, what we're doing right now in the cloud product is providing a much more kind of interactive, like rich, linkable experience. And you can't really do that in open source. Like when you're producing a JSON report, it's just hard to have that kind of referential, all those references between different elements of an object of the data. So we're making that more possible in a cloud environment. But in the open source, what you can do is you can absolutely get that list of all the things. Here X, you'll see a little X, like this one failed this time and this time and this time, and then it passed this time and that time and the other time.
Okay, that's pretty cool. All right, so one last question from me, and then like I'll give the microphone back to Eric. I think I punished him enough for abusing the ownership of the microphone at the beginning. So share something exciting that is coming in the future for Great Expectations.
I am absolutely thrilled about the cloud product. And what I like here, and I know that probably sounds like, oh, of course he's thrilled. It's because we have, it's like, the way I kind of think, we have a new concept available to us. And what is that concept? It's the user. In a library, we don't really have access to the user. We don't see who you are and when you're interacting. I mean, you're interacting with files and going to these static web pages. Whereas when we're like, where we really want to go is we want to facilitate collaboration, right? Like at the end of the day, quality is fitness for purpose. And we talked about contracts at the beginning and ensuring that people are on the same page. And so what I'm really, really excited about is the world in which, you and I are sharing a piece of data, and we both have our expectations about it. And we can just say, hey, let's go look at that validation result together. Drop in a comment like, oh, you know what? This expectation should be a little bit different. But we're turning data quality into this very, the potential for a collaborative, more of a collaborative enterprise. That's really exciting to me.
Yeah, super, super interesting. All right, that's all from my side. I mean, we'll probably going to need like another episode to discuss a little bit more. But Eric, it's all yours now.
So interesting. This has been such a fun conversation. James, I'm interested to know the flow. Understanding the technical flow was super helpful, right? So Pip install Great Expectations. Also, again, the Dickens reference not lost on me. So amazing work there.
Thank you.
Amazing work there. And it's like the best sort of, smile on the mind. So let's play out a little example here, right? So you kind of talked through the flow of like a data engineer who is, sort of implementing these expectations, connecting to data sources, running checkpoints, in some sort of, orchestration tool or wherever they're doing that, right? But let's sort of zoom out to the relationship between that data engineer. Let's just say that data engineer is Kostas, and he's using Great Expectations to, sort of drive data quality, but I'm the marketer, right? And so, expectations that Kostas is implementing on the marketing side, for whatever, it's reports or this or that, right? Sort of presupposes that Kostas and I have talked about like what I expect to see in my reports and like, the data types in these columns and all that sort of stuff. So could you help us understand what does it look like from the beginning in terms of that sort of relationship, right? Where I come with a requirement, and say, hey, like, whatever it is, like purchase values always need to be in X format, right? Because if not, then we undercount and then, my boss gets mad at me and blah, 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 right? So I have that expectation as a marketer, but I don't do anything technical, right? So like, how do I interact with Kostas? And I'd just love to hear, like, how do your customers do that? You know, when an expectation sort of originates with someone who's non-technical on a different team.
Great. Yeah, happy to dive into that. Actually, I think my favorite example of this is, I mentioned it's crazy to believe this. We started this, I think, in 2017. We gave a talk about Great Expectations, and at that very first talk, there was somebody on a data engineering team facing this problem, and she implemented Great Expectations. It's still very, very, very young product in her team, and we had a chance to connect with her much later and hear about it. And what she was doing, and I think this makes a ton of sense to me. And like, I do think we can make better workflows with a web app and so forth. But what she was doing is she would literally kind of creating forms for her team and like a structured interview. So it became it became a kind of a requirement solicitation exercise, and it really just helped to structure the conversation in a way that that was really valuable. And this is something I saw a lot in my kind of analytics work, and that sometimes we call round trips to the domain experts. So in your example, this marketing stakeholder is an expert in what the data should look like. It's really expensive to have to go back and forth, and like, expensive in time and complexity and all these things. So again, like first answer of how I see that done is it provides a mechanism for conducting structured conversations and interviews to elicit what those expectations are. The second way that I would flag is, and Kostas, this is similar to what you were kind of, I think, hinting at, is like it's sort of experimentation and having a real good notebook experience. Now, so maybe you're going to say, well, wait, do domain experts sit down and write notebooks? And no, I don't think that's the case. But I think what actually is happening in that way is that you can accelerate the level of domain expertise, if you will, of a data engineer extremely quickly when you're letting them operate on these kind of higher order concepts, instead of like, I'm staring at a CSV file.
Yeah, super interesting. Super interesting. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. That well, and actually, let me follow that up with another question. So, because there are different approaches to this, and like I'm super interested in sort of the philosophy behind the decisions Great Expectations made. Some companies that are trying to solve data quality think that there should be a software layer that sort of like facilitates that interview process, right? Or like a structured interview process, like you said. And that's an interesting, I actually struggle to know how I feel about that. I mean, not that I'm an expert in this, but like, actually sort of validating data technically is a pretty big challenge in and of itself, right? But like, solving relational connections, between two people who play very, very different roles in like a complex business, it's kind of like, can software even solve that problem, right? I mean, so in one way, it's really encouraging to hear, like, I mean, just do a really good, like, structured interview and have a form. And that is a way that you can create like a very helpful, but like simple interface between these two people. And then the data engineer can take that and translate it, using the notebook interface. But all that said, like, philosophically, what role do you think software plays, and maybe even specifically data quality software plays, in facilitating that relational interaction, irregardless of the actual technical data validation?
That's a stumper for our last question.
You got to end on a high note.
I don't know the answer to that question. And let me tell you why, or like what leads me to say that. I absolutely believe in the power of software to facilitate structured interactions of any form. So to me, when I say you have a form and you have a structured interview, like, I absolutely believe software could facilitate that and make it happen in a useful, in a powerful way. So it's actually not about like that was what we replaced. Like and to even go further, like no doubt in my mind, software will play a role in supporting those kinds of interactions. And we can do that. In fact, the way I think about it is we can do that in intelligent ways by making it's it doesn't need to start from a form, from a blank slate. Like, what is the answer here? We can say, here's the past. Like, here's what we've seen in the past. Firstly, does that meet your expectations? Secondly, what would cause the things to be different? So that's the first part. Yep. So on that side, actually, maybe I'd be like slightly different than your priors. On the other side, there's, we in modeling, we call this a lot like elicitation. So when you're interacting with an expert, you're eliciting their knowledge. And one of the things that I found is like experts actually can have a very difficult time understanding which parameters in a model are kind of doing the work. And so if I say to you, about how many days should it be sunny in your city, and we're going to put a quality measure around a weather sensor, right? And so we're going to say like, hey, if it says it's sunny every single day, maybe it's broken. Like if I ask you that question, it can be really difficult for people to get it that right. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a huge amount of that's a rich problem, and I think that doesn't have to be the problem of data quality to solve alone. That can be done in concert with a much richer ecosystem of the way that we facilitate collaboration between people, and like some of my other, like one of my long-term kind of passions is like the way that we communicate probability effectively. Like what does it actually look like for people to see probability and understand probability? So I think there's a lot to be done in that space as well. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of a vibe that we don't have to solve that problem yet in order to be providing a lot of value in data quality. Yeah, no, that was a really helpful answer. And sorry to throw that one in right at the buzzer here. James, this has been such a good show. Thank you for your thoughtful, articulate answers. We've learned so much, and I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. Eric, Kostas, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. All right. Welcome to the DataStack Show prequel, where we talk about the show we just recorded to give you a little teaser. Kostas, we talked with James from Great Expectations, which is a data quality tool. And it's really interesting. I think one of the things that was really interesting to me about the show was their approach to solving the data quality problem. A lot of the data quality companies we've talked with sort of sit on top of some repository of data, right? And then sort of detect changes, right? So it's on the data warehouse or the data lake or whatever, right? And so it can sort of detect variances, but it sort of sits on top of a repository. And Great Expectations takes a different approach. They sort of insert checkpoints based on, very explicit definitions, right? And so you sort of insert checkpoints like within a data flow. As you've built data products, you've built data pipelines. Do you think that there's merit to actually, this is a better way to say it. Do you think you need both methodologies, or is there like one sort of primary way that you would approach solving data quality?
You are really making like hard questions today. Like it's,
we did ask some hard questions.
I don't know what's wrong with you. My answer is I don't know, to be honest. I think it's probably there's no one way that you can solve quality. It's also and I think we have discussed this a lot with all the data quality folks on this show. There are so many different aspects of it that you have to go after. So I would say that, I don't know, but my guess is that probably you need both, but it also depends on let's say the use case that you have and how you work with data, and also what kind of data you work with. What I find very interesting with Great Expectations is that they are not focusing only on the problem of running tests on the data. They also focus on helping the people to come up with the definitions and share definitions, which is, let's say, not like a purely technical problem, but it's a very important aspect of the problem of quality. Like, now, is this like the right way to do it with like this collaborative environment that they have with notebooks, or like with a different way? I don't know. Like, I think it's still early in the industry, there's more experimentation to happen there, and see like at the end, like what the markets will adopt and will use. But I have to say that, like, regardless of how the solution will look like, this problem of communicating and defining the expectations that each person has around the data is part of the problem, and probably like the hardest part. So I don't know, like sooner or later, like I think like most of the vendors out there will have like to address it somehow.
Yeah, I agree. It was a super interesting episode. And I think one of the things, to give another little teaser here, is that I think this makes Great Expectations really unique in that when you write tests, they automatically turn into documentation that's easily understandable by, sort of data consumers, which is a really unique approach. So definitely tune in to hear James talk about all things data quality and the way that Great Expectations solves the problem. And we will catch you on the next show.